We had hoped to have two other colleagues with us, Martin Hartup from our sister site of Burnham Beeches in Buckinghamshire, and also James Adler from the Surrey Wildlife Trust. And it'll become clear as to why we'd hoped they'd both be here, because we've got different experiences from us. So it might be a little bit biased towards Epping Forest, but hopefully we can reflect enough of what they've both done in their respective sites. So we'll take through the slides. We've structured the talk around a manual which James got started for Surrey Wildlife Trust, and John and I, with Martin's help, put together what we're calling a best practice guide. And you'll see there on the screen now what is the front cover of the draft. It is a draft, and currently it's with the Department of Environment and Food and Rural Affairs. It's with DEFRA, and also with the Chief Veterinary Officer. So I know we can't release it, but it should be coming out fairly soon, I hope, once it's been through and approved by DEFRA. Again, it'll become more apparent as we go through the talk as to why we decided to do this. But I think the talk as we've constructed it is based very much around the structure of this guide, and so hopefully when the guide comes out you'll be able to see the same things as we'll talk about today. Just to say then, the structure of the talk will be in 5 main sections which reflect the guide's divisions, and we'll also then finish with a 6th section on the do's and don'ts of the system as we see it as users. The first section is going to be about the equipment and the components that make up invisible fencing. The second section is then going to be about training and fitting the equipment to the animals, and that's a really key section which John will take you through. We'll also then talk about planning and design. So once you've got it on your animals, once you've got and bought the components, you've still got to plan and design how you're going to graze an area, physical area. So that third part is of great importance also. We'll then talk about how you actually then install it into that physical area that you've got, and that'll be the 4th section. And then we'll finish with a rather short section about the safety aspects, and that's one of the reasons it's with the Chief Vet and DEFRA. They're just running their eyes over that to make sure they're happy with what is very new technology still in this country. So they're the sections. I'll hopefully be useful, and we'll look forward to the questions towards the end of the talk. So starting with invisible fencing, for those who are not familiar with it, it is an exciting development, I feel. Certainly for us at Epping, it's now allowed us to do grazing that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do, I think. And again, that's going to become apparent as we talk about the sites and look at the planning and development of the site, how you plan and develop your system on an actual piece of land. The key thing is there are two types of fencing, which I'll come to in a minute. One was going to be based on GPS, and there's this one which we're talking about today, which is based on a wire in the ground. But either way, they work as basically they are invisible to the eye, and they prevent the physical barriers being imposed of fencing or electric fencing, and so people, vehicles, other animals, whether wild or domestic, can cross that barrier. And that's really key in commons. It's really key on public accessible sites, and I think it has a huge potential. We talk in the manual about the kind of areas where we think it will be useful. So there is a table in the manual which lists the kind of areas, and I've mentioned commons, which are clearly massively important where fencing is difficult to put in, and I think invisible fencing does provide a real solution to that. There's also areas like woodland grazing, where in Epping Forest we have that situation where trying to run a fence through trees, particularly electric fencing, is really, really difficult. Cyclists, anybody could come across it, and you can't really garrote your public users with electric fencing just strung across an area. So invisible fencing has allowed us to thread a barrier or a boundary to the fencing through quite a complex area of vegetation in a way we couldn't achieve in any other way. Just very quickly, some background to invisible fencing. I certainly got involved in this almost 10 years ago now, and you'll see from the slide here that The Guardian rather probably correctly predicted that commercial versions were about 10 years away. What they were talking about was what was called at that time directional virtual fencing, or DVF. and that was based on GPS. And you can see the cow in the picture has a GPS receiver, and indeed has solar power pads, the idea of the battery power being powered by the sun. And we actually went down that route ourselves in 2007 at Epping Forest, trying to get a system that was really virtual, truly virtual, with no physical wire in the ground at all, the boundary being entirely virtual based on a GPS position. And I think certainly in ranges like in Texas and Australia, that's something that is achievable. But in somewhere small like Britain with lots of roads and small sites, particularly with tree cover, we gave up on it and decided it was asking for too much battery power, too much extra complexity in the system. Nonetheless, I've mentioned it here partly because that's the background to it. It's how long we've been trialling it in Epping, and I know the Ministry of Defence were looking into this system at Salisbury Plain. But the reason for mentioning it really is that Australia is still continuing with the idea. It's gone from an academic pursuit, which it was, through to a chap now who has called himself Adgersens, Agersens. Unfortunately, I haven't put his website link with me today, but I can certainly supply that. And he's currently trying to source funding and money, which he's been quite successful with so far, in developing a GPS-based system. They're looking to use it in Australia, for example, against riverine sites where they need to defend the riverine sites from erosion and from destruction by overgrazing and by cattle. But they also don't mind a little bit of breaching of the boundary. It doesn't really matter too much, so they're looking to put it on a very large scale. The great thing about the Australian system, the reason I think it's worth keeping an eye out on it, is that he's aiming to make it quite cheap and available to Australian farmers for large numbers of cattle. So that may yet, in possibly another 10 years' time, be something, a GPS-based system that might actually work. Anyway, now to the main part of the day, which is actually talking about what we're actually doing. The technology that we have in the UK that we brought into Epping was based on an AM radio signal in a wire in the ground, which John will explain more about in a minute. There is also an FM system out there now, which is being adapted for cattle, and which John can also talk about in a minute. Basically, the signal from those wires, the AM or FM signal, activates a receptor unit, which is on the cow, and you can see a couple of cows here with the collars on and the receptor unit on that collar. They get a warning sound initially, and then if they don't respond to that warning sound, they will get an electric shock. But training, as John will talk about, is the key issue there, and it works pretty well from our experience. And I'll now pass on to John to talk a little bit about the equipment and the components of invisible fencing.
Okay, so for those unfamiliar with invisible fencing, we're just going to go through the components that make up the system and how they interact with each other. So the main cable that is laid in the ground, generally as a loop, for the Beauregard system it's about 1.5 mil, and the same for the common sense fencing. They do vary slightly, but roughly the same size, with a heavy sheath on them as well. So this cable carries the signal. The receiver that the animal wears picks up the signal when the animal enters the correction zone, and it provides the electrical stimulus and audio beeps. The collars themselves are attached to the receiver units, and they have a conductive material on the inside. The signal generator generates the signal when it's attached to the two ends of the cable and sends the signal down the cable. With the two systems that are currently used in the UK, it's either AM or FM based. So the receiver units, these are the two that are mainly used. On the right hand side you have the Beauregard system, which is a lot larger than the common sense fencing on the left. The batteries for the Beauregard takes 4 AA batteries, and they have a life of about 12 months. The common sense fencing takes half an AA battery and has a life of about 18 months. The weight of the collars, the Beauregard with the collar on weighs about 1 kilogram, and the common sense fencing weighs about 250 grams. So there's quite a difference in weight. Both the units have auto shutdown features, so if an animal is stuck in a correction zone area, it won't continue to shock them. It will basically stop for a allotted amount of time. They produce different shocks as well. The Beauregard is more in line with an electric fence shock. It's about 80 millijoules. I don't have the exact figure of the shock of the common sense fencing, but it's less, and it's more of a pulsating shock than a sharp shock. So this is just a picture of the common sense fencing on an animal, which is put on nice and tight. This is a strap from the Beauregard system with a buckle on it. So when it comes to the sizes of the straps, the Beauregard system has 3 different sizes and the common sense fencing has 2 sizes. It's really important to select the right size for the animal so that you make sure it's nice and secure and so the conductive material is touching their neck. The conductive material is slightly different on the 2 systems. The Beauregard uses a braided cable and the common sense fencing uses a conductive silicone. In this picture you can also see different straps. The Beauregard started with a leather strap, but it found that water collected in the corners, which then corroded the metal braid, and then with the movement it gradually began to snap it. So all of them have moved to a woven nylon strap, which is a lot stronger as well and dries out a lot better. So the 2 signal generators that we have the Beauregard system, which is an AM system. The loop lengths on the Beauregard system is between 300 and 2,000 meters. We don't tend to run anything past 1,800 meters on the Beauregard, just to be sure that we're well in the requirements, generally because often when you draw the loop length, you can, if you don't do it with a measuring wheel, you can discount slopes which add extra length. So the Beauregard generator takes one 12-volt battery and that lasts for over a month. The common sense fencing utilises dog fence equipment. It uses a coded FM signal, and there's 4 transmitters available for that, so you can do different lengths. That system can go down to 20 meters and up to 6,500 meters, which is their newest one, which is available, but I think is more experimental at that length. The common sense fencing requires 24 volts, so you'll need 2 batteries in line, and also the battery will last for about 7 days. The large transmitter they have, which is for the 6,500 meters, requires 36 volts, so that would require 3 12-volt batteries. The training of the cattle, this is really the most important part of the system, is making sure that the animals understand what it is that's being required of them when they actually go out onto the system. It's recommended that it's in an enclosed field, so you've got a physical fence around it, because you want to change the animal's behaviour so they're responding to the audible cues, they're not getting shocks all the time. It's the beep that they hear, and once they hear that they move away from the wire. When they first interact with it, they are going to get a shock, much like an electric fence, and they'll soon learn that the audible cue means to move away. So there's 2 methods commonly used to train the cattle. Usually you put the cable up on electric fence posts. You leave it up for about 3 days so the animals can see it, they can interact with it, they can feel the correction zone, and then after a few days you then drop it, and once you're happy in the knowledge that the animals are respecting it, you can move it around on the floor just to check that they are respecting it. The other way is to train them to an electric fence first, with the invisible fence wire put roughly about 3 meters behind it, and then after a few days you can turn the electric fence off, put the invisible fence on, and then gradually move the electric fence back until it's behind the invisible fence itself. The collars should be fitted in a crush, because you have to get your hands around the animal, so you want to make sure that you're working with them very safely. And this is why when you're putting in an invisible fence, you want to be able to have at least fixed handling or portable handling at your disposal, because young animals will need to have their collars adjusted throughout the grazing season. The collars need to be on reasonably tight to make sure that you don't get a pendulum effect, which can break down the conductive part and also allow animals to flip the top over so they're not actually receiving a shock. So when you fit the collars, you want to make sure that the animal's got its head up and you can put the flat of your hand underneath, and that gives it enough clearance that the animal can eat, it's not being choked, and that the conductive material is touching their neck.
Great, thanks John, and I'll just quickly just re-show that slide just out of interest for what the slide is actually taking in the Epping Forest, and it's a classic site for training because it's a nice fenced field very close to our headquarters actually, so it was easily visited and checked. And the illustration there, the photograph shows the line where the invisible fence was, which is right at the centre of the picture heading away from the camera. You'll see on the right hand side the grass that was there to tempt them on, but was behind the invisible fence, outside the invisible fencing. and you'll see on the left the area that was actually grazed. And they really did respect that line throughout the period of training, and that was of course one way to be absolutely sure, particularly if you haven't got GPS on your animals to see where they are actually moving. It's a really good way to be absolutely sure that they are respecting that invisible fence boundary. And it's a rather neat illustration because that's actually now a 5-year-old photograph taken back in 2011 when we first tried the system, and actually we were quite surprised at how effective it was. So on to the third section. This is, as I say, the third section of the manual that we produced, which hopefully, as I say, will be out sometime next year if DEFRA approve it. And this third section is about the planning and design and how you go about it and some of the things to remember. In the manual that we produced, Martin, James, John and I, we've have a table there, table 2, which talks about sites and places and situations which are suitable for invisible fencing, because not everything is. And we've listed sites where we think entirely suitable, sites where we think some caution is required, and some sites which are not suitable. And because I'm not going to go through a long list of those right now, it will be in the manual, and I'm happy to answer questions about those. But an example would be that certainly we would regard that calves under 6 months are not really suitable for this system in any way. They're too small, there's too much to do, and it's something we want to avoid having collars on calves of that age. So that's immediately to be taken into account. If you've got a breeding system, you put animals on the site once they're older than 6 months. And as I say, the table includes a lot of other advice and ideas that we think are suitable when you're trying to consider what you're doing. Then on the slide in front of you, you'll see some bullet points really of some fairly obvious things, I guess. Clearly, you've got to think about perimeter distance. The loop size is very important. You need to make sure that you might have mapped it out on your GIS system, but if actually when you come to install it, we'll talk about installation in a moment, once you've installed it, you might find your perimeters are much longer than you realised it was going to be, and distance is really important here. The systems, certainly the Bovigard system, is commercially available for systems no greater than 2,000 metres, and we would generally encourage it to be a little bit under that. The dog fence, common sense fencing requirements are much longer than that, but nonetheless you've got to be clear what your perimeters are like. And think about what you're doing. Are you enclosing them or are you exclosing them? And I'll come back to this in a minute with a slide talking about the system that we employ at Epping. And John will talk a bit more about a site he worked on in Hertfordshire, where it was very much an enclosure system, but again had particular designs. You've clearly got to think also about topography, ditches, hedges and so on. And actually these can really help you, of course, because they can reinforce your invisible barrier, and well worth thinking about how you can reinforce it. Proximity to roads, clearly, and transport networks is critical. Again, in a moment I'll show you the kind of context and situation that Epping Forest finds itself in, where we felt, despite those limitations, despite the fact we're fragmented by roads, we were able to install this system. And I think hopefully that gives encouragement to others out there who are in more urban situations. But again, you must assess it for yourselves. One thing we came across also, the fifth bullet point here, underground and overhead services is something to be really careful about. They can interfere, particularly with the AM system that Bovigard that we use at Epping. If you've got services or particularly things that generate electrical fields, you may have interference problems that you need to think about. Also, quite obviously, you need to make sure your generator storage box, something you're going to need to check daily, is in a nice location and easily accessible, but nonetheless reasonably hidden from view from the public if you've got a highly accessible site. The final three I've sort of grouped together at the bottom there. Two of them are about public access, of course, and it's a commonsensical thing about any new system. Even if it's invisible, it's worth talking to the public and stakeholders about it. And we engaged in a great deal of stakeholder communication when we first went into this, and actually we discussed it at a public inquiry in the end, but in relation to cattle grids, but that's where the invisible fencing was discussed in some detail. And of course you've got to look at how you're public accessing the site. What are they using? Are there mountain bikes on the site which might erode the area over which or under which, sorry, your wire is buried? And finally, when you're putting in the wire, you need to really think about archaeological features, because although it's only going in a relatively shallow form, nonetheless you may well be impacting on archaeological features, and we mapped those at Epping to make sure we didn't. And as I mentioned before, using natural boundaries, this is a picture from Burnham Beeches showing a British white cow with the common sense fencing and dog fence collar on it, with the common sense fencing collar and the dog fence unit. This is a trial being carried out this autumn, and you can see the kind of vegetation, and there's lots of natural boundaries there that they can potentially use, including a water course in the background. You can't actually see, but it's in the valley, and that could be a natural boundary. Don't have tight angles, clearly, otherwise you will get interference in the system, but also cattle, you don't want to get them in the corner, and it's more important than ever with an invisible fence system, as it is with an electric fence system, not to force the system, because you are relying on the animal's behaviour. And finally, of course, including shelter and scrub, which in the natural systems that we've got it at Burnham Beeches here and at Epping Forest, where we've got plenty of cover and scrub, and we've got wood pasture systems where we want the animals in amongst trees as well as on grassland. You've got plenty of opportunity, of course, to include scrub. But if your system is more open, you do need to think quite carefully about that to make sure the animals don't get stressed and can find shelter either from the public or from, of course, heat. And now over to John to describe his enclosure system.
Okay, so this is a picture of Chorleywood Common in Hertfordshire, which is an HLS, and it is in grassland restoration. Very nice chalk grassland, 6 hectares in total. They had a big problem with grazing in the respect that they put up a fence and it was found to be illegal under the Commons Act. So in 2013 they came to us at my farm and with the idea of putting in invisible fencing. And the idea was to graze the whole area as one, but also be able to split it up into smaller sections. There was areas with bee orchids and other plants that they really wanted left till later in the season to graze. I mean, this site is very close to the M25. It's a very affluent urban area. To the south, you have the London Underground, which has a physical fence along the whole line, which is very handy. To the northeast, you have a pub with a very sharp slope heading down to the road of Dog Kennel Lane. Originally they wanted the invisible fence to go right down to the roadside, but when we designed and looked at it, we pulled it back up to the top of the slope, because if you have animals walking down the slope and they get a dog behind them, there's only one thing that's going to happen. And also in the summer, the patrons of the pub would also come out and sit on the slope to have a drink. So what we did was we created it like a pie with 3 pieces. So of the 4 boxes, 2 of them could house a signal generator. The other 2 were just connection points that you could change. So if you wanted to, you could graze 2 parts, 3 parts, or 1 part. We were also very lucky that in the south we had a section that historically had a wooden fence around it, which we called the night paddock, which was very handy that if the system ever had an issue, we knew that we could lock them up inside this paddock. And we also had handling facilities in there, because the heifers that we were using, they'd be growing. They'd be about 18 months old, so they would grow throughout the season, so we could adjust it and handle the animals if we required. This site is under HLS, so they were getting grazing payments, so the grazing had to happen. And we had to go through quite a lot of public consultation, and people were very against it at first. But after a few years of running it, the people really enjoyed seeing the cattle, and it's been a great success ever since.
And then on to a map which is a little bit less clear than that one, but I just wanted to show the situation at Epping. We also went through a lot of consultation, as I mentioned earlier, and it ended in a public inquiry about the cattle grids that we used, and I'll come on to those in a minute. The area in front of you on the map there, you can see a scale bar for a kilometre. It is a large area. The red loops are the loops we've put in as large loops. They're about 3.5 kilometres in length, which was suitable for the common sense fencing system, but are not at the moment suitable for anything commercially available from Bodyguard or from the Lakme manufacturer. And so what we've done, we decided that in grazing these networks, this very large area of wood pasture, the brown areas are areas of effectively wood pasture or woodland with lots of tree shade. The yellow areas are the areas of grassland. We wanted the animals to move naturally between the two. What we've actually gone back to is where we started back in 2011, and we've gone back to, it's more difficult to see on this, but if you look at the top end of the slide and then about centrally, you'll see a cherry coloured or cerise coloured line, wiggly lines at the north and the south, and they are what we call linear loops. So you can either do what John has shown you in the earlier slide with a proper encircling loop and divisions, or in the case of Epping, where we're dealing with a very large area, we've actually enclosed about 120 hectares between those two wiggly cherry-coloured lines. That 120 hectares is safeguarded by what I call linear barrier loops. You're effectively excluding the animals from the loop, but you're using it as a barrier simply to stop them going south or north in this case. And it's worked very effectively for us, and in fact it's what we've been using since 2011. It's allowed us to graze a very large area, which you can see that you would otherwise require those two red loops in the north only cover the same area as the linear loops can bar. The only disadvantage of that is you need more signal generators, because the linear loops themselves still can only be, in the case of the bodyguard system, they have to be under 2 kilometres or 2,000 metres long. But they have been very effective. It does mean more checking. It does mean something like 5 or 6 signal generator units instead of perhaps 1 or 2. But for us, we think for what it's achieving and allowing us to achieve at Epping, it's worth thinking about. So I do throw that out there as something that's well worth thinking about. We find linear barriers are very effective, and I know that at Burnham they've used smaller linear loops, but they've nonetheless used them as ways of connecting between existing perimeter fences which are already there. They can close gaps which they would otherwise have to put fences and gates in, which they really don't want to do. So you can use it at 2 different scales, for small scale gaps and for large scale areas like you're seeing on this map. Just very quickly to mention, I mentioned the context in which we're working. This is Epping Forest, very broad scale. I don't here illustrate where we're grazing, but it's just about the centre of the picture, in fact. The black lines running through the green are the roads, main roads. You can see at the top left-hand side the number of vehicles that are going up an A road. We're dealing with this all the time, and what that means is that as well as invisible fencing, we have put a structure in of cattle grids and bypass gates. And in the bottom right-hand corner there, you'll see also the fencing we put in. We put permanent fencing along the main A roads. Nonetheless, the invisible fencing has allowed us. To use far fewer grids. We were going to use up to 13 metal cattle grids. We've been able to reduce it to 4. So for our project, on a landscape scale, we've massively reduced costs by using invisible fencing. Then on to the 4th section, which is the 4th section in the manual. We're not going to spend too long on this. Just really to mention about installation, you need to think about how you're going to do it. Clearly in open sites like on this picture with a tractor, you can use a single mole plough. When you go through woodland, you need to possibly use something like a modified stump grinder, which we used initially. We've gone over to a mini digger system with a slot cutter attached onto the front bucket position. But there are a number of different ways of doing it, and lots of different people can do it in different ways, and I think it's something to shop around and talk to your local contractors about. Equally, dog fence, who can install the wire which common sense fencing are using for the cows. Dog fence can install the wire. They have people install wires over long lengths, and so they've got equipment to do that, and so equally they can install the dog fence system. Very quickly then on installation, the kind of things to think about. Again, we're going back here to the signal generator in particular, is make it sure it's obviously in a secure location if it's a public accessible site. In Epping we've had no problems with vandalism or interference despite having hundreds of thousands of visits to our sites a year. Strong boxes have been developed, and thanks to our grazier who began the system for us back in 2011, the Wildlife and Countryside Services, who developed the black boxes at the top. Burnham Beeches have developed the white box below. All these boxes have in common is they're strong, they're above ground, they're off the ground if possible, and they're ventilated. The key point there is the ventilation. We have found problems in the past, certainly with flooding of chambers that we did put in initially, but also just condensation. And you really need to think about that. You really do not want condensation to affect your equipment, the generator or the battery. John.
So in your installation, you're always going to have breaks in your cable at some point, or if you're installing it yourself, you'll need to connect up the cable. It's recommended, well, we use IP68 rated resin joints ourselves because we find that they're robust, sturdy. Other people have used, they have used similar sort to the telecoms industry, soldering iron, heat shrink over the top, but mainly it's to make sure that you use something that can have no dust ingress and can potentially be submerged in water. Some of our wet heathlands, the water table will be above the cable in winter, so it's got to be able to withstand water.
Thanks, John. I apologise that I put the wrong bullet point there. So it's IP68, as John was saying. The other thing you can do in installation is when you're going over water courses or under roads, you need to think about conduit pipes, and these wires can be put through pipes of all sorts of kinds, whether plastic or metal, and the signal will still work. And something that our colleague Martin Hartup worked very hard with Buckinghamshire County Council, and that was visual reinforcement. Where you're going under a road, he managed to persuade Buckingham to paint on sort of false grids, which is a really useful visual reinforcement which the cattle seem to respect, and it helps, it reminds them that there's a barrier there, and I think that's ever so useful if you can get cooperation with your local highways authority and you do need to run under a road. There is a precedent for it, and Buckinghamshire have done that. Equally at Essex, where for Epping Forest we've also had Essex's great cooperation running wires underneath a road, a highway underneath the tarmac. So it can be done. There's precedent out there. If you have an issue with your highways authority, you can talk to either ourselves or Burnham Beeches about that. Very quickly then, just wrapping up really with the two final parts of the talk, which will not take too long. The first is the fifth section in our manual, which is simply welfare and safety. John covered earlier the auto shutdown of both systems, both the common sense fencing dog fence FM system has an auto shutdown of its collar, so does the bodyguard, so shocks won't keep going if the animal's stuck and getting shocks. They will eventually shut down. Animal welfare, how well you tighten your collar, but also clearly thinking about the situation of the animal is still an issue, just as it is for normal fencing or electric fencing. That's really all this is there to say. In terms of human safety, largely this is a much, in many ways, a much safer system than something like electric fencing potentially. There's less, people are not going to get entangled up in it, and there's not the shock factor which we have had before when we used electric fencing on Epping. So it's great from that point of view, but nonetheless you still need signage, you still need to inform your people that they're coming into an area with cattle, because of course it's that much less obvious being invisible. Just very quickly on the shock, John's mentioned about shocks before, but this is not actually representing the two systems that we're talking about, but it represents that system that both in Australia and Texas were using, the GPS system, but the shocks are very similar, I think. What it shows there on the diagram is a line, you see a dotted line on the just right of centre. That's the reaction of the animal, its beats, its heart rate per minute when it got a shock from the collar. The next vertical spike to the right of that, later in the morning, it's the time on the bottom, is actually a bird flying over the cow. So you can see the kind of level of shock which is similar to what we're talking about in the shocks in our collars that we've used, is nothing more than a shock an animal might get from a surprise from something else. Sorry, just press the wrong button there. Thanks. Just move on to the next slide. Just very briefly, a very quick mention of GPS tracking. This is a heat map of just a single cow over a couple of days a few years ago, just showing how it used the site. Obviously from a biological point of view, from ecological recording, GPS is very useful, but of course it is expensive still. But we do use it for us as an extra safety backup, which is why I've mentioned it here in this safety section. John can talk more about that if you've got questions about GPS. Just very quickly then, the manual, the sixth section of the manual is just the do's and don'ts really. We've tried to limit it to 10, and I'll go through them very quickly before we finish. Clearly we've mentioned about planning the routes carefully, avoiding corners and particularly confined corners. Clearly we've mentioned about site generators, put them in dry areas, keep them above ground and ventilated, and obviously hidden from public view if you can. Make sure you train the cattle in a real, before you put them in an actual real life situation, put them in a fence system like we showed earlier. And don't, in a similar vein, do not put collars on untrained cattle and put them straight out into a real site situation. They do need to be trained, and they do need several days, if not 7 or so days to train. Then clearly test your loop before you put the cattle in it, and most importantly check, because it may vary with the topography, with the ground conditions. We don't really fully understand it ourselves as users, but the width of the warning zones where the animals first encounter the warning sound can vary, and it can vary even with the same systems. We've had it up to 3 metres away from the wire. I know certainly with the common sense fencing system at Burnham they've had it at that kind of distance, but equally you can in some cases find you're dealing with only 1.5 metres. Not always obvious why. Sometimes it might be the battery power, but it's worth checking to make absolutely sure everything's working well. Then the final 5 of those 10, of course, test your collars manually with a loop, walk over with it. You can, with the dog fence and common sense fencing system, you can switch off the shock and you can just walk over there and get the beep, but you can work out whether it's working without the cow. And of course, before you transport the cattle in, turn the loop off so they don't get the shock as they go over. It's most important to get them used to the fact that they only get shocks when they're inside. Warning signs we've mentioned, particularly for health and safety of people, more to warn them about the cattle present rather than the wire. And clearly, as we said earlier about the length of the loops, you've got to stick to what the manufacturers recommend. You can't try and push the loop longer, otherwise you may well find your signal drops very rapidly from what you were expecting, and the warning sound and then the warning shocks don't come until only centimetres next to the wire, and that's obviously no good. And then do have a return plan, of course. If you stop, do escape, which they might do. We've had escapes in our system. They might escape for all sorts of reasons, collar failures, or even just a battery running down, which you didn't realise was running down, or water in the system if you've got condensation. Anyway, if they do escape, you need a return plan for those stock, just as you would with a fenced system, an ordinary traditional fence system. Finally, very quickly, we've got some acknowledgements to make. As we've said, Martin Hartup from Burnham Beeches couldn't be with us today, nor could James Adler from Surrey Wildlife Trust, and we're very grateful to both of them for putting a lot of effort and time into both the manual, which they put a lot of time and effort into, but also into actually developing the system and different parts of the system. It really has benefited from lots of different minds coming at it from different angles. We're also indebted, as you'll see there, to Natural England, particularly at Epping, where we've had a lot of help from Natural England, both consents, because we're in a SSSI, site of special scientific interest, but also from funding. And then the retailer Henderson, who've been able to retail the Lakme or Bovigard system. They've been very helpful, and they've done their own trials and their own work in other parts of England. And Common Sense Fencing, of course, Darren Brito, who worked for Surrey Wildlife Trust for some time and is now developing the dog fence system into this system which can be used on cattle. And they're really, if those bottom 3, they're Common Sense Fencing, Lakme and Henderson's are the key people to talk to if you want to either buy the system or thinking about installing it. And I think that's all from us for today, apart from any questions and answers which we can take now.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Jeremy and John. That was a very interesting from my point of view. And we're just going to open the panel up now to have a look at the questions that you guys have been sending in. So if you hadn't done already, please do now. This is your opportunity to ask the guys anything that you want to expand upon a little bit more or that's been bugging you. But as you know, this isn't just now or never. If you think of it after the event, please do email in and we can answer the questions in-house or pass them on to Jeremy or John or the team here at the LI. As per usual, 24 hours after the webinar is shown, there will be an automatic feedback email, so that will be your opportunity to email us in with any afterthoughts you may have, or even after this Q&A. If we haven't quite got to the nub of your question, you can continue the conversation then, so please do feel free. Okay, are you happy to start answering questions?
Very much so, yes.
Lovely. We've got one here from Graham who says, have you ever had an animal that has crossed the invisible fence which has been shocked, which has panicked and continued moving further into the area to be protected?
Well, generally when an animal gets shocked, it will actually go across the wire, so it will then be out of the invisible fence system, and they'll generally linger on the other side. They have the herd mentality, so they generally wait around. Normally it's if they've been chased by a dog or something. You know, once an animal's running and it's got the adrenaline up, like a physical fence, it will go through a physical fence. With the invisible fence, it will go over it, it will receive a shock, but it will go over it. And generally found that it doesn't tend to run too far away from the herd because it likes to be with the rest of the animals.
And so it's an interesting question also in relation to the linear loops that John and I use at Epping. What we've made sure with those is when we've installed the invisible fence as a linear loop, Of course, the animal is effectively outside what is the loop. They come across the wire. If they were to panic and go across that first wire, they of course potentially could cross into a no man's land before they then cross the second wire, because it's a linear loop. So if they'd crossed the first wire, what we wanted to make sure was there was a large enough gap between that first wire that they encounter, which is their boundary, and the second wire, which is the outside of that linear loop. Now, we made sure there was at least a 10-metre gap, sometimes up to a 20-metre gap. So you need to build that into your planning of your system if you're planning it on an area. In our case, we've got a very large area of 120 hectares we're enclosing, so we had the space to allow a 20-metre area. And the idea was, as John's just said, if they might panic enough to cross the first line, but then find themselves between the two lines of a linear loop, and what you don't want is them to continue being shocked. So if you are planning a linear loop and using it as a barrier, then make sure you've got a good gap, a good sized gap between each wire of that linear loop, and there the animal, if it finds itself in no man's land, isn't getting a continual shock.
Oh, great. Thanks very much, guys. Graham, I hope that's answered your question. If not, please do continue the conversation. Drop us another question if that didn't quite hit the nail, but hopefully that answered your question. On to a question from David now. Is this system only available for cattle, or can it be used for sheep and ponies, horses, etc.?
It's been designed for cattle, but I know that both systems are being trialled on ponies at the minute. I think the main issue is to do with the collars, that the ponies can quite easily flick them off. So while they are being trialled at the minute, I don't think they are being sold as for use with ponies, but I'd say watch this space and see what happens when the trials finish.
Great. Thanks, David, for your question. Hope that answered it for you. Got another question here from Janet. So you do have to keep the loop and collars on indefinitely, even after animals are trained?
No, once the animals are trained, we always make sure that as soon as they come out of an invisible fence system and either go into a shed or into a traditionally enclosed physical field, we take the collars off. So that as soon as the animal has the collar on, it knows that it's in an invisible fence mode. We do retrain the animals every year. Generally it only takes 3 to 4 days if an animal's already been trained. When you first train them, it can take between 7 to 14. So no, when they're not in an invisible fence system, we take the collars off, they live their normal life, and then when they come back to it, we give them a short training period again, and then they go back out.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Janet, for that question. We're on to one from Nick now. He says that I'm aware that animal welfare bodies strongly dislike these invisible systems for use with dogs. Have you asked what they think about using it on cattle?
Thanks for that question, Nick. In a way, that's one of the reasons that we produced this user guide and this manual from our point of view with, say, 5 or 6 years experience now at Epping, 4 years experience at Burnham, and a couple of years experience at Surrey Wildlife Trust, and we've put that manual in front of DEFRA and the Chief Veterinary Officer. The key issue, I think, it relates particularly to Wales, where the dog fence system, Wales introduced a ban, the Welsh Parliament did, largely because I think people were using, as I understand it, a remote control system where they could shock the dog and try and train it using that. The cattle system doesn't do that at all. The collar can only be activated by the cow coming near the wire. You can't, as a person, shock the animal separately from that. And that was, I think, what caused the initial upset in Wales. As we mentioned earlier, the system here was very safe. The shock levels are lower generally than they would be for standard electric fencing. They're much more controlled and administered in a more controlled fashion than an electric fence would be. The voltage, the joules, the energy going in is limited. And the other thing, of course, as John said, there's an auto cut-off, so you can't keep shocking the animal. It can't get stuck in a situation where it's going to continue to get shocked. We've used it on animals now of different range of sizes and different breeds for over 6 years, and for 6 years, and we've had no problems whatsoever with welfare.
Wonderful. Anything to add on that, John?
No.
No. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I was just from personal experience with family farms and things. It's a much safer option than having a solid fence where the animal could get stuck and not be able to get to it and have a prolonged.
Yeah, just on that, Laura. I mean, yeah, the electric fencing in the forest where we have used electric fencing, standard electric fencing, that's an issue for us with deer, because deer get tangled up with it, and of course for the public it's an issue. But very often we understand that because that voltage, the charge and voltage can be varied upon an electric fence, very often it's set too high, and of course it's the discretion of the farmer or the landowner to how much he turns that electric fence up with, particularly if it's through vegetation, it's shorting out, then sometimes it gets turned up. Good thing about this system, it's set, the units on the collar are set to give us shock at a certain amount. You know exactly what that is. As I say, it's an auto cut-off as well, so I think it's a much more controlled system actually than standard electric fencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like it. Sounds much better. All right, we have a question from Julia now, saying roughly how much does this cost?
Well, you're best to speak to the manufacturers to get the prices, because it will all depend on what type of transmitter and collars that you're after. But to give you some ballpark figures, I think for the Beauregard, the generator is probably around £600, and the collars and receiver are probably about £450 per collar. The common sense fencing, which uses the dog fence equipment, you're probably looking at about £400 for the transmitter and probably about £250 for the collars. The cable installation, you're probably looking at about £1.50 a metre for that.
So certainly one thing to add to, I think from our point of view, is that if the installation can be relatively inexpensive, and certainly when we looked at the installation costs compared to say wooden fencing or any other type of fencing, even electric fencing, that installation is really cheap. The wire is relatively inexpensive, and you only need, if you can do a big loop, you only need one generator possibly, which is a one-off expense. The issue really is it's the multiplier effect of how many collars you're putting on how many cattle. So I think if you've got a system where you don't actually need that many animals and you've got a kind of flying herd or flying flock situation where you're moving them around from site to site, I think it can be really good value. Clearly at Epping we've got, we want to eventually have up to 120 animals out on site, and if we want them all collared up, that's clearly quite a big cost at the moment, the way the individual units are. But I think that there hopefully will come down, but we'll see how both systems develop. And as John said, best to talk to the retailers, Henderson's in this case for bodyguard, and common sense fencing for the dog fence adapted system.
And as generic, business terms, economies of scale, as this gets more popular, the per unit cost will inevitably come down. So,
we'd hope so, and
yeah.
I think you have to talk, as I say, to the two retailers involved, to say Henderson's and Common Sense Fencing. The manual will have their full details, but we can provide those full details after this webinar as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about this before, and we're going to, when the manual comes out and when it's all set up properly, we will add this on the link underneath in the comment section of the YouTube video. So we'll just wait, give it a few more minutes. We've had some wonderful questions and some really helpful answers here. But if you did miss your opportunity or didn't think that your question would get heard, please do feel free to keep them coming in now. We've got a few more minutes to work with. But I will just say this is being recorded and it will be put up on our website and embedded into YouTube. We will drop this. What's the document's name here?
So the Invisible Fence Best Practice Guide.
The guide onto the comments, so it'll be available for everyone when we get that signed off.
You just need it signed off by DEFRA, that's right.
Exactly. So maybe not immediate, but and obviously it's quite hard to say exactly when it will be, but as soon as we'll have it, we'll give it to you. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you found this webinar as exciting as I did. Yes, we've just had some thanks coming in from several of you attendees for the speakers today, the wonderful speakers. That's Dr. Jeremy Dagley and John Hill. So thank you very, very much for coming in today and giving that wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you.
And I'll also use this as an opportunity to plug next week's webinar. So do join us again, always the same time, Thursdays at 1 p.m. till 2 p.m. with us. And next week it is the Potter and Ponder Sensory Trail at Croom, and that we're going to have some wonderful speakers as part of the Capability Brown Festival coming and talking to you about this wonderful sensory trail that they've set up at Croom, focusing for people with autism. So please join us again next week for that. Thank you everybody for your questions, and thanks to the speakers, and have a good day.